receive a briefing from the Chamber of Commerce and Economic Development Corporation on process and operations.
Afternoon, Mayor, members of the council. I haven't seen many of you since the election. I'd like to thank you for your public service. I know all of you give up something to come here and do this, and time and other resources, and certainly speaking on behalf of the organizations that I represent, we appreciate that. I've got some folks from our chamber board, past and present, and also KEDC here. Their main purpose is to make sure that I don't misspeak and misinform you, and they'll point that out to me very quickly. Also appreciate the opportunity to provide you with this orientation. Typically, we do an orientation for new KEDC members, for new city council members, and for new chamber board members, one-on-one. So this is an opportunity to get many of you in a group, and it makes it a whole lot easier for me. We'll also apologize to a couple of you who have been through this process before. For some of you, this will be a repetition, but hopefully I'll expose you to more information. In a way of process, I'd really like to talk about this and talk about three different organizations and defer one. The one that I will defer is a tax increment reinvestment zone. That's an important organization that we developed with the city and city staff for a future date. You will have some decisions to make about that because 4 of the 7 board members are city appointments. And we do have a project coming up fairly quickly that will involve the tax increment reinvestment zone. And so we need to get you prepared for that, but got enough to talk about tonight without getting into that, and I'll work with Glenn, city staff to figure out a time to do that later. A number of those appointments have expired, and you will need to act on them. Talk a little bit about economic development in general and how it's been practiced in the state and how I think that has impacted Killeen and put us in the situation that we're in today. For much of the history of this state, economic development essentially was not practiced. Our economy was based on agriculture and oil and gas. It was a natural resource-based economy. Very little manufacturing here. Most manufacturing in the state up until the 1980s was based around those 2 economic sectors, either agricultural manufacturing or the refining of petroleum products and petrochemicals, primarily around the port areas of the state. The state has, up until the last 20 years, not been involved in economic development. They have chosen to take the position that economic development should be conducted through communities. It hadn't been until really Governor Perry that the state has gotten fairly involved in economic development. The first economic development entities that were created in communities, and this holds true for Killeen as well as many other communities around the state, are what they call industrial foundations. And here in Killeen, we have the Killeen Industrial Foundation, and it is the oldest economic development organization in the community. It was created by the private sector. Private business people contributed their money to a tax-exempt organization for the purpose of buying property to hold for sites for employers. And the philosophy in those days, and this all started about 1950, which is about the time KIF was created here. The philosophy in those days was we really have 2 resources in abundance: a lot of land and cheap labor, unskilled labor for the most part. So many communities coupled those and began to chase manufacturing. For the most part, places I lived and worked, we were very unsuccessful at that because most companies were located either on the East Coast or the West Coast. because that's where the manufacturing processes were. Those were the business centers. And commerce moved across the country from east to west and west to east. Chicago was the center of that. And for the most part, the state of Texas and the communities surrounding it were too far south. The transportation cost was too high, and we really couldn't participate in diversifying our economy. That began to change in 1980, really in the 1970s, when it became apparent that oil and gas, mining, were not going to carry our economy forward. We had all of those economic disruptions that began to occur. And folks in the state and communities and also at the state level really started to look at things differently. And the state took some steps that caused communities to reevaluate how they were going about this process. There were some other things that happened outside of state actions that impacted that as well that I'll talk a little bit about. Give you a book, Phyllis, if you wouldn't mind. This first book speaks to the Killeen Economic Development Corporation, and I'll talk a little bit about what I know about the history of that. And these are kind of the foundation documents that we have on KEDC. I get a lot of questions about KEDC, and this provides a lot of the information. The first section of this is a document that I wrote about 4 years ago called Meeting the Economic Development Competition, and I'm not going to read this document to you, but it contains an introduction to a subject that affects us and I think probably led to the formation of KEDC. In 1989, the state of Texas passed the Economic Development Act of 1989. The legislature passed that act. And that act permitted cities to collect a sales tax for economic development purposes. It's the first time in the history of the state. And as I think most of you know, sales taxes are regulated by the state of Texas. And the state law is that the maximum that can be collected in the state is 8.25%. And you are the collectors of that money. And you collect that money, whatever the percentage that's authorized in this political subdivision. You submit that to the state. The state keeps 6.25%. And state law permits a maximum of 2% or 2 cents on the dollar to be used for what is called local auction. And you can't collect any more than that. But when the Economic Development Act was passed and it permitted cities to collect a sales tax for economic development, that really had a very traumatic effect in the state because there were many cities that weren't collecting 2 cents. They were collecting something less. And many of them went out and passed the sales tax for economic development. And under the law, you can, if your citizens will approve it, you can collect a sales tax for economic development if you have existing capacity in 1/8 cent increments. So you can collect up to 1/2 cent in 1/8 cent increments. And if you look at that first document I mentioned in section 1, and this data is about 4 years old because my source played out at that point in time. The middle part of it, that point in time, there were 524 cities collecting a sales tax for economic development in the state. Those cities collected a total of $338,661,590 annually. The average population of cities collecting sales tax was 11,341. The average amount collected by a city was $646,184. City of Killeen and other cities like it could not pass the sales tax for economic development because you're at 2 cents. Theoretically, there's a way you can do that. You can put a ballot, you can put a provision on a ballot to submit to voters to roll back part of that 2 cents. And then in a separate election, you can put a sales tax for economic development on a ballot, and if voters approve it, then you can begin to collect it. And most communities that are at 2 cents don't think they can pull off 2 successful elections in a row. In the case of Killeen, the way your sales tax is allocated is there's a half-cent that is for the purpose of reducing the effect of ad valorem taxes. That was passed before 1989. It was on the books. 1 cent goes to the general fund. You collect a half-cent for the county. And there's a lot of debate about why the city, the county, and how the county got that half-cent collected. And I'm not going to go there tonight because there's a lot of denial, and a lot of folks say it had to do with the Expo Center, and the Expo Center's built, so the county ought to give it up. I don't think any of that's going to happen. The reality is, you collect 8.25%, 6.25% stays with the state, 2% comes to you. All of that money is allocated, and the only way you can change that is through a vote. Now, that has some interesting ramifications, because fundamentally what that did was that created two kinds of cities in the state of Texas. Those with the sales tax and those without. I'll give you a feel for what that means in our immediate proximity. There are 2 cities proximate to us that have the sales tax for economic development, both at a half-cent. Copper's Cove, and this is 2010 data, population 32,000, collects $936,600 a year in sales tax for economic development. Belton, 2010 data, population 18,000, $880,300 a year. I'll give you an example. The community I came from, Harlingen in the Rio Grande Valley, a population of 65,000, collects $3,810,700 a year under that tax. Now, there are advantages and disadvantages to having the sales tax for economic development. So all is not lost. The uses to which the sales tax for economic development can be put are very restricted, and they become more restricted over the years. When the law was first passed, there were very few restrictions. There were prescriptions as to how you had to administer the tax and that sort of thing. But because of the competitive elements that exist, the tax can no longer be used for retail for the most part. It cannot be used for educational institutions. And I'll give you a feel for the way that plays out. KEDC and the city of Temple have created entities to do economic development that are not funded with the sales tax. They don't suffer from those limitations. Members of KEDC have decided to provide funds for scholarships at Texas A&M University Central Texas for really 2 purposes. One, to meet the enrollment criteria that the legislature required or the governor required to get the standalone status, and 2, to keep a commitment that was made to the chancellor of the A&M system to engender his enthusiastic support for the creation of the university. Lost my train of thought. If we were a sales tax city, we could not do that. KEDC provides matching funds, and when I say matching funds, if those of us that work that, named the Friends of Texas A&M, when we go out and solicit funds, KEDC will match up to a certain amount, dollar for dollar. So we go to the Copper's Cove Economic Development Corporation, and we ask them for $100,000, and they're all excited about it until their attorney says, wait a minute, you can't do that. It's not prohibited under the law. Fortunately, Copper's Cove had an industrial foundation that had $100,000, and they were able to provide the matching funds. So there's a great deal more flexibility with the Killeen Economic Development Corporation. All that to tell you that I suspect that the reason the Killeen Economic Development Corporation was created was, like many communities around the state, to meet this competition that everyone knew was going to come from cities who could collect the sales tax for economic development. Really ramped up the level of competition in the state. And those differences that I talked about are significant. In this document, this reference document, and I'm not going to speak about all of it, obviously, I've got in section 2 a history and background information of the Killeen Economic Development Corporation. The Killeen Economic Development Corporation, just so you know, was created by the city of Killeen, and all of its governing documents were created by the city of Killeen. And it specifies very clearly how KEDC was set up. There are 9 members of KEDC specified in those governing documents. 3 are nominated by the City Council, 3 are nominated by the Killeen Industrial Foundation, 3 are nominated by the Board of Directors of the Greater Killeen Chamber of Commerce. And that's to force a marriage between elected officials and the private sector. Those members, 3 of those members rotate off every year. They serve 3-year terms. And we'll talk about the roster in a minute, because again, you've got some decisions to make about that. The governing documents specify that whoever is in my position, the president and CEO of the chamber, will serve as secretary and chief of staff of KEDC. They also specify that GKCC is not compensated for that service. They specify that our staff will provide the staff for KEDC at no compensation, which is fine with us. All of those founding documents are in here. The purposes to which KEDC can address itself, the kinds of things it can engage in, are included in this document. And also on beginning on the second page of section 2, I've listed a large number of accomplishments or activities that in which KEDC is engaged over the years. For example, the first thing we list there is KEDC took over the industrial park created by the Killeen Industrial Foundation and expanded that park. And it now has a promissory note with the Killeen Industrial Foundation to cover the cost of that. KIF is repaid as land is sold, their investment in a part of that park. And that promissory note is in one section of this document. KEDC's built 2 speculative buildings in the park that produce revenue that again go to KEDC uses, and I'll show you a copy of the financials in just a minute that demonstrate that. So that is a kind of return on the investment. KEDC built a lot of infrastructure in the park, including up to this past year to facilitate an expansion of the Pepsi facility. KEDC is operated to recruit and expand tenants in the park, and I've listed a number of those there. KEDC has been required to fund the passenger marketing program for the airport, and that was a system that was being designed and set up when I came here, and the way that develops is that the Director of Aviation comes forward with a request, explains to members of KEDC what that funding will be used for, and they authorize the expenditure. And the invoices come to me, and they're paid out of KEDC funds. Very unusual arrangement, but that's the way it works here. Utility lines on Clear Creek Road from Stan Sleeter Loop to the new regional airport. Those were paid for by KEDC. Funding for the Veteran Cemetery, there was a significant community portion of that was paid for by KEDC. I mentioned the matching funds earlier to drive the university forward. We do things like they provided $1.5 million in funding to do preliminary engineering and environmental work for a joint task force working on the development of a second runway at Gray Army Airfield for the purpose of providing redundancy to the Killeen Fort Hood Regional Airport and to give us an opportunity to diversify the mission at Fort Hood through the attraction of air assets. And that is a joint community Fort Hood task force. Most recently, KEDC has provided funding for the development of the master plan for the National Museum of Mounted Warfare. So far as I know, that's the only transfer of KEDC funds to GKCC. That was about an $80,000 project.
How much?
About an $80,000 project. We entered into a performance agreement, we being the chamber, with KEDC to develop the RFP, to select and supervise the consulting firm that developed that master plan, because the museum had no staff in place at the time. KEDC has provided startup funding to hire staff for the National Mounted Warfare Foundation in the amount of $1.3 million for 3 years. There's one item that's not listed on here, and I'll talk more about the museum as I get into the chamber aspect, because it's really a good example of how public-private partnerships are supposed to work, in my opinion. Mentioned the Heart of Texas Defense Alliance. KEDC is the largest funder of the Heart of Texas Defense Alliance, as it should be, since we're the largest city closest to the flagpole at Fort Hood. And they are our most vigorous collaborator. The one project that's not on here, and I know, Mayor Corbin, you recall this, was the location of the shallow ends and suites. Another good example of how a public-private partnership is supposed to operate. The city wanted to attract a convention hotel here to complement the Killeen Convention Center, Conference Center. Had done that unsuccessfully. City owned land adjacent to it on the corner where Shallow is. Shallow had an interest in coming here. Prior to Shallow's arrival here, we had a tremendous pent-up demand for hotel rooms in this community, primarily because the thought was you cannot build a facility that will charge more than the federal per diem rate, because no one is going to pay it. And I know when I came here temporarily commuting, it was very hard to find a hotel room. And the top rate I paid was $65 or $70. And the community had an annual effort to go to the federal government and say, you got to raise it per diem, you got to raise it per diem, we need more of this, we need more of that. It was a Shiloh that came here and said, we'll invest our money, we'll charge the rates that we want to charge, but you guys are going to have to help us get situated to do that. And KEDC, working with the council and our staff, was able to enter into a performance agreement with Shiloh, whereby KEDC bought the property that Shiloh was on at the market price, because that's what you have to charge, then discounted that property by 50%, $500,000, to induce the Shiloh to spend $17 million to build that hotel. And then it entered into a promissory note with Shiloh for the balance of that money. The result of that was for a $500,000 investment fundamentally. We got a $17 million capital investment in a new hotel, and literally thousands of rooms built in this community after that, as a result of the fact that Mr. Hemstreet was going to charge $90 for a room, unheard of in this community. Well, everybody wanted to build hotels that got $90 a night, and so that's why literally thousands of hotel rooms showed up here. That had a tremendous impact on the capital investment that drives ad valorem taxes, a tremendous surge in hotel motel tax, lodging taxes occurred as a result of that. So fundamentally, KEDC acting with the city changed the paradigm here in terms of lodging in a very productive way for all of us. There's a purpose statement in here. I included in section 4 policy manual, because you need to know that the members of KEDC, one of their jobs is to adopt policies to keep KEDC out of legal trouble and govern its operations. And there are a number of policies in there that, like a conflict of interest policy, there are some federal laws that are required, that we're required to obey, and we've got policies about that. There's policies in here about our audits, our audit process. That is, the policy manual really creates infrastructure that causes KEDC to operate legally and observe the law, even though those laws change very rapidly. So that's the policy manual if you want to see it. Section 5 contains an operations